Welcome to the second episode of the Formula E Zone podcast. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing the Santiago E-Prix round 3 of season 5 of Formula E. It was a cracking race, so let's jump into it. And in today's episode, we've got a very similar lineup to the last podcast, and making his return to the podcast is Jack. Welcome back, Jack.
Hello everybody, thank you very much for having me back, and looking forward to it.
It's going to be a good one. It was a good race. And also, joining us once again for the second week in a row is Tobias.
Did you just say hello, Jack?
Yeah.
Jesus, I thought we were professionals.
Well, bit off topic now, but there was an episode of The Big Bang Theory where Leonard said hello when he was nervous in front of the girls. So, I went for it.
Hello. I'm going to pick that up for my daily English.
And yeah,
now.
I'm the English one.
It's part of my vocabulary.
Yeah, don't be
Never
nervous.
Mind. You live and
Hello,
learn.
everyone.
Don't send this off the rails before we've
Lads,
even
we're
started.
Definitely.
Okay, good. Are we all happy? Are we all comfy? Are we all ready to talk some Formula E? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Right, so
Definitely.
this week we were in Santiago, made a return back to Chile, a new circuit layout, which was an interesting move, but I think the circuit worked a lot better for fans, and I think the race itself was much better than last year, but I'm sure we'll all have our separate thoughts on that a little bit later on. But we started the weekend with a little bit of drama in practice. We saw Sebastian Buemi starting the weekend off in pretty crazy fashion, smashing up his Nissan early doors, and then we moved on to qualifying, which, well, I think there's lots to talk about in qualifying, isn't there? I think, for me, anyway, the best qualifying of the season. If you can't tell, I'm jumping straight into this. No messing today. There's so much to get through. But for me, it was the best one of the season. And it was a real, it felt like a classic Formula E qualifying. A crazy result. We saw some of the biggest championship leaders right at the back of the grid. And we even saw some new names and some, I suppose, teams that haven't really shown their true colours yet, fighting at the front. So I'll start with you, Tobias. What were your initial thoughts with quali?
As you said, it was crazy. I mean, we had the championship leading drivers, the top 4 at least, qualify right at the back of the grid, outside the top 10. I think all of them, bar the Tachitas, qualified outside of the top 15 even, with D'Ambrosio starting the race from, let me just check, P20. So that's a long, long way back from where he's, I don't know if he's supposed to be there, but where he wants to be. So that's the main takeaway, as you mentioned already. The big setup of the grid with the favorite drivers, in air quotes, of course, favorite drivers, starting right at the back.
Yeah, pretty much the same for me. It was a crazy qualifying session, but for me I think Formula E really needs to be careful with this track evolution, as I don't think Chile could be the only track where we could see this. There could be track evolution thinking about it at Berlin, which Tobias will know extremely well, as it's a concrete surface layout very similar to the one that we had at Chile, and there could be track evolution that could happen there. But we have to think about it. If there's other places where we're going to have the championship leaders starting in Group 1 and there could be track evolution at other tracks, then we can't go into race weekends every week having track evolution deciding qualifying. You can't just penalise the championship leader for starting in Group 1 and then having a mixed up grid. That's not qualifying in my opinion. You can't have that every week. Yes, it was a great spectacle for the fans, and this series, it throws everything up in the air. The championship leaders at the back, you think it's going to be a quality race, and you have that, but the qualifying session's not really supposed to be that. The qualifying session is supposed to be the fastest man on track who gets pole position, and if you're going to have this much track evolution, then you're not really having that. That's not really a qualifying session, but yes, it's good for the show, but is it fit for purpose? So I don't think we can have that all the time. But, that is my theory around it.
Well, we saw both Verne and Lotterer after the qualifying, didn't we? Both coming out and slamming the qualifying system, saying it really needs a drastic change. So I'm not too sure, but is that what you're saying, that it needs a big change, or is it just little tweaks you're meaning?
it's great every once in a while, having a mixed up grid. And again, I put up a post saying that how times have changed in Formula E, where Buemi and Degrassi are 1 and 2, and yet we're considering it a mixed up grid, which I thought was interesting. But yeah, it's fine. Don't get me wrong. I think it's great having a mixed up grid, but we can't have it every week because that's just not qualifying.
Okay, yeah, I think I'm kind of with you, and we had a little chat just beforehand, didn't we? And I'm definitely in the camp that I think it's strange that the championship leaders always go out first. I don't know why in my head I thought it was randomly assigned which groups went out first and second, but it is a strange one. I don't know if you have any thoughts about the quali system, Tobias, if you want it changed or whatever.
I mean, I'm pretty happy with how qualifying is set up right now. There is a reason why the first couple of drivers in the championship the current championship standings are qualifying in Group 1. The main reason for why track evolution was so significant in Santiago obviously was that the track was placed right in a park, in a practically forest, with trees hanging over the surface, and they lost leaves in the meantime. It was dusty, and all of the dust settles between FP2 and qualifying, and obviously the guys in qualifying Group 1 have to clean up for the others, or don't have to, but they do clean up for the others. So the qualifying group number 4 has better track conditions than qualifying group number 1. There's more grip, there's less dust, there are less leaves. That being said, I think that the evolution won't be as significant in Mexico next time out, because, I mean, that's a semi-permanent circuit with less trees, and, I mean, there's still going to be dust, but less other... Well, let's just call it debris out there on the track between FP2 and qualifying. Same for Berlin. Of course, it has to do with the surface. It's heating up minute by minute, especially in Chile, where the temperatures were rising and rising all the way, until the race started, really. So that's another factor playing into that. But I don't think we're going to see the same effect of track evolution the next time out in Mexico. And that's why I think we don't really have to change anything about qualifying, because I think Santiago was an exception.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was an exception, 100%, but Formula E has to be very wary of this. So it can't happen in other places. We've seen it, and at other tracks. I think Paris, thinking one now as an example, where people complained about track evolution, and I think it could definitely play a massive part in a qualifying session. I'm not saying that we need to have drastic changes to the qualifying system. The qualifying system in Formula E works, and it works really well, and it does sometimes bring up these really interesting grids, but I don't think it has to change. But if it was to keep happening in Mexico, or if it would happen in Monaco, because Monaco is another one where it could happen, even though it's a street circuit, a very good one as we know, but track evolution can still happen there, and you don't really want races, qualifying sessions, being decided by mixed up grids and not having the right person at front. So for me, if we kept seeing this, then that's not qualifying, and then something needs to change. So I just think Formula E just needs to look at it.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's a complete different kettle of fish to Formula 1. So Formula E has that slightly gimmicky, more fun element, I believe, and I think it's a much more modernised sport than Formula 1 is. And I think the fact that we get these mixed up grids where some of the championship leaders at the back, for weekends like this one in particular, overtaking looks so difficult, even with attack mode. I think if we had the two Cheetahs and BMWs at the front, that could have, I suppose, made the race a little bit more on the boring side. So for me, I like that element of a mixed up grid, but I think, yeah, we're all in agreement that we like it. But I do agree with you, Jack. If it happened every single race, then it does become a bit too much of a gimmick, and then you're starting to question it. But moving on into Superpole, we did see, I suppose, in my opinion, some teams that were a little bit surprising to be up at the front. We saw the two Audis make it through to Superpole, Sam Bird and Stoffel van Dorn. And I'm not going to lie, it was a crazy grid. It really was in the end, but something that was the theme throughout this whole weekend was penalties. And after an incredible lap from Lucas di Grassi in Superpole, over half a second, I believe it was, over the man in second place, he was hit with a time penalty after his lap during his first group qualifying. Now, I want to know what you two think of this, because it looks a little bit, especially to newer fans, a little bit like a daylight robbery, forcing him to move from pole position, not just to move him 5 places back, but all the way to the very back of the grid. So it was a big, strong decision, and one that really shaped the race. So I'll come to you first, Jack, because I'm sure you've got lots to talk about with this one, because it's an interesting point.
Too much brakes in the M-lap. That is what the FIA said. Too much brakes in an unusual pattern compared to how he did his fast lap, which just doesn't make sense. Because obviously, thinking about it, right, you're going to use more brakes than your called out lap. But you know, we have no footage though. It's really hard to judge because we have no footage of his lap. You know, was he braking ridiculously down the straight, warming up his tyres? But why would you do that? Like on a cool down lap, for example, that's like you do that on a warm up lap. So it just makes no sense. Obviously, it's really hard to judge because there's no footage that has been released. It's just, you know, that's what, from reading the FIA statement, it just doesn't make sense. Like, how do you use too much brakes? It doesn't make sense. I know we're talking about the pit lane collision in Marrakesh, and it was brought in for that reason. But, you know, for me, it just doesn't make sense. Unless there is clear footage of him doing some crazy braking stuff, then, okay, fine. But, I don't know. It just doesn't make much sense. But, you know, just to pick up on your point, surprising people in Super Bowl, you said. And you mentioned the 2 Audis. And I know, just a sidetrack quickly from the di Grassi penalty, I thought it was how funny that our Constructors' champions are surprised to be in Super Bowl. Which, I think, well, maybe that they are. But I think now that they are starting to get hold of their powertrain, obviously Virgin are doing quite well of it, and they seem to be obviously moving in the right direction, that maybe they might be able to sneak in and get some Super Bowl appearances now. But, you know, it was strange and it was definitely interesting. But 100%, di Grassi's penalty was, you know, just a bit weird.
Tobias, are you similar thoughts?
I mean, it's a weird rule, but I understand where the FIA is coming from. The thing is, Michelin, the guys that provide the tyres for all teams, they recommend sort of tyre pressures before the weekend, and all teams have to, well, obey to these rules and regulations by Michelin. So they say you need to have your tyres in this range of pressure. However, as most teams go into qualifying, they, well, have less pressure in their tyres, because less pressure makes the car go quicker, especially in quick corners. Less pressure is just generally better for your car on a hot lap. And what the drivers then do is try to heat up their tyres on the in-lap. And hotter tyres means, well, the air in the tyre expands and you have higher tyre pressures. And that's pretty much what di Grassi did. He warmed up his tyres on the in-lap. So after, of course, before his outlap, or on his outlap, before his hot lap, he kind of had to warm up the tyres, although the temperatures in Santiago were so hot, he didn't really have to do too much there. But on his in-lap, he tried to push his tyre temperatures as much to the top as possible, and you obviously can use your brakes for that, and using the brakes makes the brakes go hotter, obviously. And when they are then waiting in qualifying in parc fermé conditions for their Superpole lap, they are obviously waiting, nobody's touching these cars, and just the brakes cooling down and sort of soaking the heat, could lead to damage for the brakes, and that's what, or to the calipers specifically, and that's what happened to Tom Dillman in Morocco, as we found out now. He used too much brakes on his in-lap, and then the brakes gave up on him because, I don't know if you could, I mean, figuratively speaking, his brakes melted on his in-lap. And the same idea, or that's the idea behind this rule, in order not to have brake failures after in-laps, drivers may not use more brakes in their in-lap than on their hot lap, if that makes any sense. So that's where the rule comes from. Credit where it's due. Credits to eRacing365 who found all of that out. Just by the way.
It's interesting that you said that, because obviously we discussed it, but what I was interested in was the FIA statement, and which, too much brakes, like what does that mean? Like, if you said what you just said, Tobias, then that makes sense. He's trying to gain an advantage because his tyre pressures were low, and they're trying to get an advantage from that. So he's trying to brake, so he raises those temperatures up, and you can see. But if the FIA had said that in their statement straight away, then it would have made sense, right? But they didn't. If they said yes, he was using too much brakes, therefore we're skeptical that the tyre pressures were low, and he's done that to raise them, then fine, that makes sense. Everybody's happy. But they didn't. They just said braking too much in an unusual pattern, and you can't just leave ambiguity like that around. So yeah, to me it was just strange.
Exactly, yeah, and especially speaking as journalists, what do we tell our audiences? Because we don't know what the heck is going on with the rules ourselves. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, it was just so ambiguous. What does that mean? If I was to go out on my flying lap, what does that mean? If I just stamp on the brakes 10% more than I normally did, does that give a penalty? That's what the way the FIA said it, that's how it read. So if the FIA was clear on the penalty for Di Grassi, I feel like it would have made much more sense, and everyone would have been happy. Okay,
I don't know.
I just feel like they needed to be clearer on what they were saying, and it just left us thinking, when we were reading it, like, what? And I'm sure everyone else was like that.
Yeah, and it took us 2 full days to find out the whole reason behind the penalty. So yeah, I'm all with you.
Exactly, you had to, quote the reason for the FIA. Then you get the fans messaging you on Twitter saying, what on earth does too much brakes mean? I'm like, I'm with you. I don't understand myself. I'm just letting you know that's the reason, Don't ask me. I'm not the guy. Don't shoot the messenger.
Yeah, there were so many new fans, weren't there, just coming out and saying, what is going on? And it's putting people off Formula E, which really does wind me up, because what it really boils down to was it was a brilliant qualifying session, but just little things like that at the moment really seem to be holding Formula E back. I think every single weekend there's been something like this that's really let down the show. So it was disappointing, and for Di Grassi as well, who, like I say, did that stunning lap, for then it to be thrown away with that tiny, I suppose you could call it a mistake in one sense, but then on the other hand, if no other drivers are doing it, then it's probably a little bit sloppy from Di Grassi, but he doesn't seem to be catching a break at the moment, which I do feel sorry for him. But look at last season. Well, yeah, yeah. But I will say, just quickly, and then we'll move on from qualifying, brilliant jobs from both Pascal Wehrlein in his second weekend in Formula E. He's really did a solid job in qualifying and continued to do so in the race. But Stoffel van Dorn in the HWA, I know track evolution, but getting that car, which I think a lot of people would agree is the worst car on the grid, getting that through into Superpole was a really solid job, and he's another one who needs to catch a break, so that was great to see. But let's move on to the race then, the main bit, the main show, and it was a great race. I'll start off by saying that, and with a Sebastian Buemi on pole position, with a Pascal Wehrlein behind, Daniel Abt and Sam Bird, it really looked like it was going to be a naughty race, and the opening few laps weren't too crazy. I think on the first lap there was no contact whatsoever. I know Lucas Di Grassi cut the chicane and there was a slight investigation about that, but nothing ever came of that as far as I'm aware. And I suppose the first real big sort of talking points was the amount of crashes that were going on in, I suppose, the midfield and the lower end of the grid. So we're talking maybe 10 minutes into the race. Everything, well, usually in a race at this point, is calming down, but for some reason today the drivers just had the opposite effect. And we saw championship contenders Lotterer, Da Costa and Jean-Eric Vergne all make contact. And I think, I have the sneaky suspicion, we all might have different views on this crash. So I think this should be a fun one to talk about. But how I see it was, Well, I see it as Lotterer's fault. I see it as they're all coming into the final hairpin. Verne's just a complete innocent bystander. He's then got Da Costa behind him, Lotterer behind him, and I think Lotterer just went in too hot, a little bit like Lucas Di Grassi did later on in the race with Jose Maria Lopez. Not quite to the same degree, but I think he went in a little too hot, hit Da Costa in the rear, Da Costa then hit Verne in the rear, and ultimately it was that damage that really didn't help towards their eventual retirements. But I'll go towards you, Toby, first. I don't think I've done that for a little while. How do you see this incident?
I don't think I want to blame anyone, because that's just how things are in the midfield. I think just psychologically that's really interesting to talk about, because we had all the championship leading drivers, as we mentioned already, well, fighting for positions 15, maybe 12 at best, and we had Verne and Da Costa and Lotterer all together in one place, and all of them are part of the top 5, or have been part of the top 5 of the championship going into Santiago, and they all obviously wanted to get to the front as quickly as possible, and somebody had to lose their composure at some point, I think. In this case it was Lotterer, who pushed Felix Da Costa into the rear end of Verne, who got spun, pretty much the innocent bystander, and dropping back to P20 at that time. I don't really want to blame anyone. I think it was a racing incident, just an ordinary scene in a race. Well, not really ordinary, that's the wrong word, but I mean, a thing that can happen in the midfield.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it was a racing incident, and I don't think there was any penalties dished out for that one, which I think that's fair enough. Penalties were a little bit inconsistent over this particular race, but I agree with you on that. I think I'm more just meaning if I was going to put the blame anywhere, it'd be Lotterer. But I agree with you. Jack, please disagree with us. Make it interesting.
Well, I'll try, but it was a collision. I think it was mainly due to frustration that was the problem here. We had that mixed up qualifying, and they were at the back of the grid and they weren't making progress, and that is sometimes the problem with having mixed up grids, and all of a sudden they don't make progress and you're expecting them to, and they're the front runners to make that progress throughout the field, and they fight their way to the front and make an interesting race. And in Chile that did not happen, and that can be sometimes a problem with mixed up grids. Once if that doesn't happen, we always think that it'll be an interesting race, but sometimes that doesn't happen, and they were stuck in the midfield. And I think frustration played a part, and desperation maybe, just to try and get the move done, and it caused the collision. So maybe frustration, maybe I'm just putting that theory in there and it doesn't really even exist, but maybe if you look at it that way, they were stuck in the midfield for about 15 minutes outside the points. I think it was Verne that he started 13th, and he hadn't even moved into the points, and he was still stuck outside the points. So I definitely think frustration had played a big part in that, and they ended up having a collision. Verne and Da Costa and Lotterer was able to continue despite his front wing damage, but Da Costa and Verne were out of the race by severe substantial collision and suspension damage. Sometimes mixed up grids don't give you the race that you're after, and I know that the motorsport community have been talking about mixed up grids as quite big, but sometimes you don't get what you want, and it may be that the championship is interesting, but you don't want your championship leaders or protagonists retiring from the race because of silly things.
I really like that twist you've just put on it there. I think that's quite clever. I'll give you that. Wow.
I actually think that's the first time I've actually impressed someone.
No, it's impressive, because if you think about it as well, I think the majority of motorsport fans that follow Formula E consider that Techeetah to be the best car on the grid, yet Verne is nowhere in the championship. Techeetah are yet to win a race. So, I imagine that frustration is starting to kick in now. I like that. Well done, Jack. That was impressive. That's given me a lot to think about as well, actually, because we also had Di Grassi in there and D'Ambrosio, didn't we? And maybe those two making it to the end and D'Ambrosio eventually getting into the points, maybe that proves that what we spoke about in the last podcast, those two drivers, especially D'Ambrosio, seems to be a little bit less hot-headed, a little bit more consistent. And I suppose, frustration. I think you can tell I'm impressed with that. That was good. Anyway, I'll stop fanboying over that theory in a minute. Moving further on in the race, we saw some drivers in particularly poor cars fighting up in particularly impressive positions. As we just mentioned, we had all these drivers, the two Techeetah cars, Da Costa, De Grassi, D'Ambrosio at the back of the grid, which left opportunities for the likes of Van Dorn at the front, Mortara, and Max Gunther. And I just wanted to quickly mention Gunther because he was having a really strong race and he's had a really difficult start to Formula E and is someone that I've had a little bit of a go at times. Think he's gone under the radar, but I just wanted to talk to you, Tobias, about this because I know you quite like Gunther. So when he did pull over, I imagine a few tears your end.
Well, not already tears, but frustration this time again because he had, I don't know if he had the same issue in practice, but he had a lot of fighting to do with his Dragon car in practice already. And, well, he started up his car going out onto his laps in FP1 already, I think. Or FP2. Or both. No idea. But he came to a halt on track, had to reset his car, got going again for a couple of seconds, stopped again, and repeated that loop for, 3 times. No, I think 3 times, yeah. And then they seemed to have fixed the problem, but then, well, fate struck again in race, and he had to retire with some software-related issue. I still have no idea no idea about the details. What was wrong with his car, but it looked from the outside as if he had the same problem that he used to have in practice again in the race.
Yeah, he's another one, isn't he? Needs to catch a break. But straight after this incident, yellow flags came out. It was unsure if we'd go to full course yellow, which we eventually did. But as soon as those yellow flags came out, on the other side of the circuit, we had a little incident involving Alexander Sims and Eduardo Mortara. And I find this a little bit of an interesting incident, I'm not going to lie. Slapped with a 10-second penalty, which had crazy implications come the finish line. But from the onboards we have seen, I know the FIA and the stewards have probably, I'd like to think, have seen more onboards and more angles, but I don't think there was any contact. And if there was, it was so minimal. I think the penalty he got was mega harsh and mega crazy. Jack, please correct me if I'm going crazy, but it really didn't look like he hit him.
Well, the FI have spoken, so they must have touched, but, it didn't really look like they touched. When you watched the replays, I was squinting and trying to stare at Sims's front wing, and I couldn't really see the touch, to be fair. I couldn't really see him touch that rear diffuser and sending Mortar around, so it was definitely strange. But then at the same time, we've seen it so many times in motorsport where the cars are on the edge, and especially going through the 8, 9, 10 chicane. And Mortara's car must have been on that edge so much, and that it was the tiniest amount of margins or taps that could send that car around. And sometimes that's all it needs. As people say, that you could probably just put your hand out and you could just turn the car around with your hand, and then that would send it in the spin, because they're so on balance, they're so on edge that it could easily happen. But honestly, I think the penalty was a bit harsh. I don't think Sims could have done much. Sims was carrying such a better momentum through the corner. It looked like, to be honest with you, that Mortara was coming into making a correction, because his car did significantly slow into that turn 10 exit, and I think that's what caught Sims out, because that's where the contact, if there was contact, then that's where the contact happened, and that was just, that faintest of touch was enough to send him round. But to be hit with a penalty, I think, was harsh. You've seen bigger touches get away with it. And yes, Mortara spun, but we've seen, bigger collisions where there's no penalties, just because he spun and there was a penalty. So, yes, he did spin, but Mortara was able to recover, and he lost 2 positions. And but BMW ended up protesting the decisions. Sims, after the race, was furious. I remember he went, he said he'd gone to the stewards, he didn't understand, and then he said he was going to go and speak to Mortara, and depending on what Mortara had said, and that would, whether or not, if he felt there was a touch and so forth, then that would, obviously cause BMW to protest the decision, which obviously they went on to do. But within 2 hours, it was rejected because the steward said there's no new evidence that had come out to say that you didn't hit him, and they looked at the photos and there was nothing conclusive to say that you hadn't actually touched him or you have touched him or so forth. So yeah, tough decision. Where's VAR when you need it? Although technically in this case we did have VAR.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what I found strange as well was that in Parc Fermé at the end, Sims parked up where the podium finishers parked up. So he must have found out after the race, I'm thinking, or else obviously he wouldn't have parked where the podium finishers were, which makes it even more bizarre. I'll come to you, Toby. How do you see this incident?
I don't have much to add.
That's fair enough.
Yeah, I was talking and I realised, I think I've left Tobias a bit short here. I pretty comprehensively reviewed that BMW thing, so apologies.
Don't apologise. After the race, Sims said that he didn't feel anything. I have another talking point, a really interesting one. As you said, Sims or BMW went to the steward's room and complained about the penalty, obviously. And in the which indicates that they were unhappy with how race control decided on the situation. However, in the press release after the race, they quoted Sims, or Sims was quoted saying that he accepts the penalty, that he doesn't really, that he doesn't understand it 100%, but that he, understands it and accepts it. Which kind of is the opposite reaction to running to the steward's room and protesting, and I don't know. Anyway, I don't really have much to add to what Jack said earlier.
No, I get your point, but from that press release, I think what that press release was coming out, that came out actually a day late after the race, so that gave BMW a lot of time to actually write their press release. And from that, you could tell that they had been to the stewards, and he's gone there and he's accepted the penalty. He's got it, he's accepted it, but you could still see from those quotes that he didn't understand how he's got that penalty. And he's like, I've seen it, but I still really don't get it. And so I get what they're saying, but then at the same time, I think really, and that's the problem sometimes with press releases, and I think it sort of overshadows what they're trying to say. They're trying to be too politically correct, but I get your point. But it was a good point, well made.
Yeah, a good closing note. That's what it's like. Nothing we can change now.
Yeah, I think we all agree. Very strange incident, and again, I seem to keep saying this for most of the drivers on the grid. He seems to be running out of luck at the moment, and this could have been 2 weekends on the bounce where he could have been on the podium. So I'm sure it's just a matter of time. That car does look quick, and it does look like it's going to be one of the best across the entire season, but there's not that many races in Formula E. And talking about limited chances, we will move on to who was race leader at this point, Sebastian Buemi, someone who was leading straight from the word go, doing a really, I suppose, classic Buemi race. Almost looked like the Buemi from Season 2, Season 3. He was back, he was dominating, and part of me thought, this is really good to see. This is Formula E back at its best. And then, after the full course yellow that we spoke about, he did something that was very un-Buemi-like, and I like to put it, he bottled it and smacked it into the wall. He binned it, which I found very bizarre. I'm not going to lie. Toby, I'll let you speak for this one, because Jack stole the last one. But my God, I was in shock.
Yeah, what a bizarre incident, wasn't it? He had the same... It was a carbon copy of a scene we saw in Free Practice 1, where he was locking up going into turn 7, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was turn 7. So a long left-hander followed by a quick and tight right-hander, where you slam on the brakes while still turning. And that obviously takes load out of the outside tyre. That could be an explanation for why he locked up in practice. But usually you don't repeat... If it's your own mistake, you don't repeat the same mistake in the race as well, especially when you're leading the bloody race. Still, I feel that Buemi kind of was the victim of another brake-by-wire incident, maybe. I think, and Buemi certainly thinks the same, that software did play a role in that incident. Well, he lost the lead after slamming into the outside wall of turn 7 and, had to retire the car soon after. Wehrlein and Bird both went through. He nursed the car back to the pits but retired soon after. So yeah, he looked to be not really dominating this race, but he looked to be one of the contenders for the victory, and sadly had to retire then.
But we've seen this too many times from Buemi. It's not the first time, and straight away Buenos Aires Season 1 comes to mind when he crashed after intense pressure from Lucas Di Grassi, and it seems like he was put under intense pressure for a long periods of time, and he cracked basically, and he broke his suspension and he hit the wall and he was out of the race from a leading position. Exact same happened in Chile. He was under intense pressure, this time from Sam Bird, and then he led every lap, but he was still under pressure from Bird, and then he cracked again. And you can't really do that anymore. I felt sorry for him because he's a class driver, and he's been fantastic for Formula E, and what he's done, he deserved the win. But you can't make mistakes like this in this championship anymore. Drivers in this series will just eat you up if you do that. And that's the only thing that I can really say. We've seen it, too many times, and he can be such a super consistent driver, but he has to get it out of him, these collisions, especially in street circuits, because there's nowhere to hide. And that's what I love about Formula E and this championship, because there's just nowhere to hide, and I love it for that.
But I'll still give him the benefit of the doubt and say that software might have played a role in that.
He could have done. I'm not saying that it was a lame driver excuse, but it was a driver excuse at the end of the day.
Sure.
But I don't know. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, but he does this too often. But it's another driver that deserves a break, but unfortunately for him, that was his big chance this season so far.
Yeah, I do agree with you both. I do, and I think again, Jack, you're right. I think the pressure a little bit, even the fact that he hasn't got a win for an entire season now. And I think what a lot of people forget is that, okay, it's not a completely new team, but Nissan, this is their first full year in Formula E, and I know they're an evolution of Renault Edams, but still, for a lot of people within that team, this is a new experience. So the fact that it was not only going to be their first podium, but their first win, I think probably got into his head a little bit as well. But yeah, you think of arguably a legend in Formula E, Buemi, most wins of anyone. It was a shock, and I think he'll definitely be kicking himself, because I'm not too sure how many chances this season Nissan are really going to have to win another race. But someone else, surprisingly enough, who's going to be kicking himself is Stoffel van Dorn, another non-finish, which I'm sure thousands of Formula E fans who love to vote for him in the fan booths will be very gutted to hear. He's having a really difficult start to his life in Formula E, and this weekend crashed, I suppose, I was going to say bizarrely, but defending round turn 3, I believe it was, just where the attack mode zone was, got onto the marbles, into the wall. We don't need to spend too long on this, because I think it's pretty straightforward what happened, but Jack, how do you feel about Stoff?
You know what, for Van Dorn, there was just a lot of positives for him. And, he was really competitive, and he has to walk away from this thinking, that was my first competitive race in Formula E. Yes, it didn't end the way I wanted it to end, rather than thinking about, another setback, think about it as this was Van Dorn showing us that he is a good driver, and he can race in this championship. And he is a class driver. We know that from his GP2 days. He was fantastic there. So just go away from this race, Van Dorn, thinking, you know what? It was a mistake. I've learned from it. But I've also learned so much about this. And this championship, this series, I got so much out of it. And I've proven to myself that I am quick. So hopefully for him, he takes the positives from this weekend rather than the negatives.
Yeah. And for me, I think at that point, running about 5th place, that is such a strong effort in that HWA. We saw in Saudi Arabia, he qualified 4th, I believe it was there, but just dropped back instantly. Whereas this weekend, he seemed to really be not keeping up with the leaders, but he was able to keep those guys behind. And I suppose if the incident happened to Daniel Abt, and Sims had got his penalty, he could have very well been on the podium. So it was a very impressive weekend from Stoff despite that incident. Tobias, you got anything to add?
There's this lovely thing about Formula E where each and every driver could theoretically win the race with taking machinery out of the equation. In Formula 1, that's not the case. You could put Lewis Hamilton in a old Marussia car, or Caterham, as they were called a long time ago. They're not racing in F1 any longer, but nobody could get anywhere near the top 10 in these backmarker cars. Virgin, when they were in F1, they were nowhere. In a Formula E, you theoretically have the worst powertrain of all. Venturi isn't really the icing on the Formula E powertrain cake, but they could theoretically, with a good driver, still move all the way to the top 5. And that's what the performances of Pascal Wehrlein and Stoffel van Dorn have shown. These drivers are top-class drivers, and you could put them in any car in Formula E, and they could get to the top 5, top 3, or maybe win a race. So that's the thing I love about Formula E, and Stoffel's performance in the last 3 races has really shown that again. You could... The teams are just so closely matched. And although, of course, powertrains do make a difference between the teams, it's not as much of a difference as it is in F1. And that's what keeps the field nicely closed and packed together. I love it.
I think actually Formula E are doing a really great job in keeping costs down. I feel like, the field's only covered by a second, and that's why track evolution played such a massive role in that qualifying session, because if you give that time away just in track evolution, suddenly, like D'Ambrosio found, you're at the bottom of the pack. But, if you're thinking more Formula 1, if there was higher costs and there's a 3-second gap between the bottom, then it doesn't matter really about track evolution, because, the bottom cars will catch up. But even without the track evolution, the quicker cars would still probably qualify at the top. So just having that second gap has really, kept the field interesting and allowed those changes and allowed us to witness those mixed up grids. But you've got to give Formula E credit for that cost capping and keeping the field competitive.
And you see, I think that's how this race was decided, because the grid is so close in Formula E. Spoiler alert, here comes the results. Sam Bird went on to win the race, but in those closing stages with Pascal Wehrlein, who actually I think managed his attack mode really well, managed to hold on to one of them till the very end of the race. Actually, again, just a quick note, attack mode worked really well again, so chuffed to see that's working. But Wehrlein, strategy worked really well, and when he went for that move around the outside of turn 12, I believe it was, I was thinking, oh my god, this is right on the limit, and the tension was really building, and we saw from Stoffel that if you make a tiny mistake and you're onto the marbles, you're in the walls, so it was really getting to breaking point, and for me, that experience of Bird was what pushed him through, and was able to pick him the win in Santiago. But I want to know from each of you, who was your driver of the day? I'll start with you, Tobias. There's a lot to choose from this weekend, so please go ahead.
I'm picking Pascal Wehrlein. He had a fantastic race, and I think 2 fantastic races. He was outstanding in the Marrakesh qualifying, outstanding in the Santiago qualifying again, and then obviously found his way all the way, to battling for the lead with the ever strong Sam Bird, way more experienced than Pascal, who obviously has a lot to learn still in Formula E, and to be there already fighting for race victories, that's really impressed me. Or he has really impressed me in the first 2 races, and we're going to see a lot more of Pascal's driving abilities this season, I'm sure.
Yeah, he's definitely one of the top shouts. It was a mega drive. Jack, are you thinking the same lines, or are you thinking someone a little bit different?
I'm trying to be different because if we all go for the same driver, like I've said before, it'll be a bit boring. But Wehrlein was fantastic, and from the word go, I remember watching his car in practice, he was just fantastic. But Dan, I think I'll leave you with a difficult spot and force you to pick someone. So I'm going to go with Sam Bird because he was wonderful. You know, the way he managed that race was fantastic. He handled the pressure perfectly from Wehrlein at the end and fully deserved the win. So now, Dan, drum roll. Let's see who you choose.
Well, part of me thinks I've been put in a difficult spot, but I'm looking at drivers like D'Ambrosio, even De Grassi that started all the way at the back and worked their way through. Robin Frains, 15th up to 5th. That was a really strong drive that I think went under the radar. But I'm going to give it to Edoardo Mortara, someone who I've been mega critical of this year, thinking that he's going to be out halfway through the season. I wasn't impressed last year, but somehow, even though he was pirouetted, managed to, apart from that, keep his nose clean, got the job done in a car which I think it's fair to say, you slightly mentioned it earlier, Tobias, is probably the worst on the grid in terms of powertrain, and for the whole season they've not even looked like they were going to get points. So to be that close to a podium, I think is a mega job from Mortara. So yeah, that's my driver for the day, and like I started off, I think this has been my race of the season. It just pips Marrakesh for me. I don't know about you two.
Who does it? I think I'll still prefer Marrakesh over Santiago. That being said, Santiago still was really enjoyable to watch.
Santiago was a tough race to report on. I don't think it was the best race though. I think Marrakesh had more frills and spills, and you know this race was crazy due to other elements, I would say, rather than Marrakesh, which was more natural racing from what we saw in Santiago. It was a good race though, don't get me wrong, Santiago, but I think the post-race penalties, which happened, sort of tainted the race. So Marrakesh is still my number one.
Alright, that's fair enough. I think I lean more on it as just the fact that there was so much tension. You never knew. If someone made a slight mistake, they were in the wall. And for me, just, I don't know, we're all different in terms of motorsport fans and what we want from a race, but I love it when they're right on the edge. And I think that's one of the reasons I love Formula E, that it is street circuits, and a slight mistake, like Buemi, it really can throw the race wide open. But you wanted to talk about penalties, and that is, well, a mega talking point, and it's something that's given a lot of people a lot of headaches. I know that all of us have got mega headaches from these penalties. It's something in motorsport which is always divisive, but I think it's something that Formula E needs to sort out, because too many times this weekend, and it was a penalty-heavy weekend, don't get me wrong, there was plenty of incidents for the stewards to be dealing with in only a 45-minute race, but there was incidents like the podium, where on the podium we found out Sam Bird was under investigation, like Alexander Sims, like even D'Ambrosio. We thought he was at the top of the championship, we find out he's not, then we find out he is, then we find out he's not. It was pretty mad. I'll let either of you take that, because just thinking about it really starts to hurt my head.
Do you want to go, Tobias?
No, you go first.
No?
I'll have to.
Well, we'll just pass it back and forth. No, you go. No, you go. No, you go. Right. It was a bit crazy, wasn't it? But when I saw Sam Bird was underway, I thought, he's out. Wehrlein's won. Like, how do you survive that? But so he did, and so there must have been an adding up error, like, because how can you be underway and then you're not? So someone's done something wrong before releasing the message. Someone really just should have double checked. I feel like they went, oh, he's underway, quick, hit the button, hit the button, hit the button, and they went, oh, no, actually, he isn't. Oh, never mind, we'll just put, oh, he's no longer under investigation. But it scared us. Like, I saw that message, and honestly, I just stopped reporting. And for all the British viewers out there, I did my best Duncan Bannatyne impression. I said, I'm out. Like on Dragon's Den. I just couldn't do it. I was just like, no way that you're going to throw this race up in the air with that. But thankfully he wasn't underweight. But I just don't understand that one. Well, Tobias, you want to take over for D'Ambrosio, because, yeah, I was done after that.
Well, what happened with D'Ambrosio was that there were these two full course yellow phases in the race. And in one of them, he took 8 seconds to slow down to the 50 kilometers an hour that are mandated by the FIA. So as soon as the full course yellow is being called and you hear the race director counting down from 10, 9, 8, and as soon as the countdown hits 0, you have to be at 50 kilometers an hour. And it took him 8 full seconds to get down to 50. I don't think he really continued pushing for 8 seconds. He might have been going, 70 kilometers an hour and then slowing down to 60, maybe 55. And, well, the FIA data loggers found him to be, speeding for a full 8 seconds. And that pushed him back in the final standings from P8, where he finished. So he had a fantastic race, started in 20th and moved up to 8th, and had his penalty being applied. I think it was a 5-second penalty, was it? Yeah. And, that pushed him back to P10, sadly.
And lo and behold, Sam Bird is leading the championship by 1 point.
It's actually a bit mad, isn't it? I mean, after that first race as well, where Virgin didn't look like they were going to be even getting on the podium anytime soon, 2 races later saying he's top of the championship. Classic Formula E. You really never know what's going to happen, but I think we'll about leave it there. It was a crazy race in Santiago, and I can't wait for next time in Mexico City. But this weekend, a race really determined by multiple penalties, crazy temperatures, and a crazy circuit. And wow, it's been a lot of fun talking to you both. I really love this race, I'm sure you can all agree. But I just want to say, Tobias, thank you for coming and joining us once again.
Thanks for having me on. My pleasure.
And Jack, as always, it's been brilliant listening to you, and I'm still fanboying over that theory you had earlier.
Well, I'm here every week. Well, every race review, so I suppose we'll see you in 3 weeks.
So that's it then for another episode of the Formula E Zone podcast. As you can tell, it was brilliant talking to both Toby and to Jack, and I think we all really enjoyed this race, and we'd love to know your thoughts, which you can either leave in the comments section below, or feel free to tweet us over at the Formula E Zone, or head over to our website, Formula E Zone, to check out all the latest and greatest Formula E news. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time in Mexico.